Just want to say hi to everybody that's here. My name is Taylor LaSalle. They're giving me the get going here, like I'm a presenter at the awards session. We got to get moving. Just want to say thanks for SABR for having me. I've been to lots of different conferences with Arnell and seen him speak. Seen the Driveline guys talk, and I kind of wonder what I'm doing here. So with World Baseball Classic, I feel like one of the guys in low A or double A who gets called up to spring training games because all the big league guys are playing for the World Baseball Classic. So I hope I can pinch hit. I'm just going to talk a little bit today about some of the kind of the work that we do at Point Loma and just some data that we've been kind of working on recently. And so I'll be talking about the impact of stride length on pelvis energy flow in high school and collegiate baseball pitchers. If you're familiar with Point Loma, we're down in San Diego, and basically we've got one of the most amazing views in baseball. So if you're out in the spring, come and catch a college game, and that's our field on the top right there. We at the pitching lab, you heard Arnell speak earlier. We consider ourselves a mobile pitching lab, so we kind of can set up and assess pitchers and hitters. We've gone into major league bullpens. We've gone into major league hitting cages. We have our facility, which is just about 15-20 minutes away from our main campus. Our main campus is right on the ocean on some cliffs that overlook the Pacific. But we can kind of set up wherever we need to be and collaborate with teams, collaborate with other performance facilities. So just an overview today. I'm just going to kind of give an intro to pitching biomechanics. We heard some deep dives, so I'm just going to kind of reel it back a little bit for those of you that aren't familiar with biomechanics or some of the things that we do and that we look into. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the work from Ryan Croton and Daniel Ramsey, some work that they started publishing as early as 2014 and that they've been kind of putting out since then. And then I'm going to focus most of my time talking about stride length, and then kind of looking at some of the application of energy flow to stride length and how that applies to players. So, I have this slide here because we speak a lot about phases and events in pitching. I actually have a book from the 50s that actually has a hand drawn. I wish I could have taken a picture of it now. But people have been talking about pitching for decades. And as biomechanists, we kind of need to kind of have a starting point and an agreement place where we can all sit down and talk about similar things and compare with each other. And so on the bottom, we have phases, which is kind of like periods of time that we talk about, the wind-up phase, the stride phase, an arm cocking, an arm acceleration phase. And then within those phases, we can take snapshots. Kyle talked about max external rotation or a layback, right? There's just a snapshot that says, what is this individual pitcher's max external rotation? Where is he at ball release? And so we can use those phases or key events to help track pitchers over time or compare pitchers to each other. Or if you're making changes to pitchers' mechanics as a coach, you can compare within pitcher. And so some pictures have already been shown of our lab and what they do up at Driveline. But for those that aren't familiar, we use marker data mostly, but we also do markerless motion capture. We put reflective markers on the body. You can notice our pitcher here is throwing just in a pair of compression shorts. So everything's applied to the skin itself. The fabric of clothing is going to move. And so we really want to focus on measuring the segments moving through space for pitchers and hitters. And that's best applied when we actually put reflective markers on the skin itself. And then through our cameras, we can take those markers, integrate them into a software, and then we build out models like you see on the right. You can also notice on the bottom of the right, we have some gray squares, and those are force platforms. And so you can see on the drive leg, there's a big red arrow pointing up to his armpit. That is the force that the pitcher is driving into the ground to accelerate forward and build momentum down the mound. What we can do, I don't have any sweet videos, but that allows us to take that model and integrate it into what we like to use as a skeleton. And then now we can look at ground reaction forces, or the forces that the pitcher is applying into the ground. And then we can look at key frames This is just prior to stride foot contact. And we can look from the back, from the front, we can look overhead, and you can notice kind of what we would call shoulder horizontal abduction, but layman's terms is like a scap load or a scap retraction. And then we can actually put valuable numbers to that and end ranges for individual athletes and kind of compare that individual over time, or as Driveline does, to a larger database. And so going back to this allows us to basically look at things that are key events: max knee height, stride foot contact, max external rotation, ball release, and then internal rotation. And that's just like a really good basic overview of baseball pitching mechanics for those of you that aren't familiar with it. And I'm going to spend most of my time kind of diving into stride foot contact, stride phase, and stride length. Before I do that, I just want to touch upon these two co-authors, Ryan and Dan. They have published a lot on changes in altering pitchers' stride length. And so that's the data that I'm going to be talking about briefly at the end of this. And they allowed us to kind of have access to their data and use some of the energy flow analysis that Arnell's been doing, and to kind of tease out some differences within pitchers. So what is exactly stride length? And Kyle touched upon this. You know, each lab is different. It's kind of tough. There's not one universal way to measure stride length. Sometimes it's using just the rubber and then looking at maybe the heel or the ankle bone where the stride foot or lead leg contacts the ground, and measuring that distance. You can measure from ankle joint to ankle joint. You can measure from heel to heel. So, you know, roughly it's just how long that pitcher takes a step or a stride down the mound. Typically, we in our lab and a lot of others measure that in percent of body height. You can also get centimeters and inches. Percent body height's pretty, I say, normalized, and because it's individual to the pitcher's height. We've seen in MLB pitchers anywhere from the low end being around 65% of their body height as a stride length, all the way up to 100%, or just even over 100% of their body height is their stride length. And so when you're working with athletes and looking at especially performance, I just threw up a couple articles here that suggest that if you can increase your stride length, there's a good likelihood that you're going to increase your ball velocity or your performance. So who wants to, who wouldn't want to throw faster? And then recently there was a study among over 300 professional pitchers. And basically their takeaway was this: if you stride less than 80%, there's a good likelihood that if you can stride greater than 80%, you're going to be able to increase your ball velocity. And so this kind of stands out. But at the same time, I can throw up a number of other resources and publications from youth all the way up to professional pitchers that says, stride length, changing it, 5% or 10%, probably not going to help with performance. So the data out there right now, I would say, is inconclusive, and it's probably going to be, I'm sure all of you are familiar, very individually based. But I just kind of wanted to set the scene and go back to a study that was first published in 2014, but has continued to be published. So this was a study that was performed in a lab. And so there's been some comments about in-game data, and in-game data is king. There's just nothing that can trump that. But there's a few things that we can control for in the lab, and obviously having force plates and measuring force that the pitchers are producing and using that to calculate energy flow is going to be really beneficial. And so this is a study that Ryan and Dan did in high school and collegiate pitchers. And they basically said, look, we're going to measure your normal stride length. And these individuals' normal stride length was right around 67% of their body height. And then they said, what we're going to do is we're going to increase that stride length by about 25%. And we're going to have you throw a bullpen with that increased stride length. And then we're going to have you come back and you're going to throw that same bullpen, but we're going to decrease your stride length by 25%. And hopefully we can tease out some differences and see what happens to your mechanics and also to your velocity. So you can kind of see here, roughly 18 to 19 years old. You'll see in research, we often call them, healthy or don't want to, or at least our lab, we don't want to collect anybody who's had an injury or a recent injury or is rehabbing from Tommy John's. So we just want to make sure that they're cleared by a medical doctor, a PT or AT to be able to throw. So what we saw, or what Ryan and Dan saw initially that was really interesting, is that despite this change in stride length, their ball velocity didn't really change at all. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the metric system, they're basically throwing right around 76, 77 miles per hour, which is kind of what we would expect in a lab setting for a group of kind of 18 and 19-year-olds. One of the things that they did notice that they saw with those who basically understrode or decreased their normal stride by 25% were some kind of key things that they would say would be, not the best mechanically. One is the improper timing of pelvic and hip rotation in relation to things like hip shoulder separation or stride foot contact. They also saw an increase in lateral trunk tilt. So that side tilt, that side bend that a pitcher can get into, and it decreased their forward momentum. And from a biomechanics side, from individuals who kind of dig into this stuff, too much lateral tilt or a decrease in momentum while maintaining velocity could lead to added stress on the elbow and basically what we'd call not optimizing your mechanics. So it's interesting that these pitchers were able to find different strategies, or I would say compensate for the challenge of striding less, but they were still able to maintain velocity. So what we kind of looked into was what's going on the energy side. What's happening when you change a pitcher's stride, especially kind of from the ground up? What are the compensations that must occur? So if you think about that, if you're going to take a longer step, that means you're going to have to generate more energy to get there. It also means you're going to be probably planted on the ground a little bit longer to get into that. And so on the drive leg, they noticed in the overstride that there was a greater amount of force applied into the ground. Okay, like that makes sense, right? On the flip side of that, though, if you're generating more force on the back end, you've got to, as a pitcher, be able to stop and block and carry that momentum into your arm at ball release. And so what they found, and what we agree with, is there is an even greater braking force in the stride leg for those pitchers that strided by 25%. And these were statistically significant in both these cases. And so going back to some of the stuff that Arnell's talked about, we look at the kinetic chain, we look at kind of building momentum, we look at, energy that's going into the ground to drive a pitcher down the mound. Where does that energy need to go? Where does it move through? And through Arnell's work and work with Kristen Nicholson from the Wake Forest Pitching Lab, they came out with this paper recently, Lower Body Contributions to Pelvis Energy Flow. And basically, what I like to think about is as a pitcher, as an athlete, we kind of have two engines. You've got your lower half, your legs. They can help drive down the mound and build momentum, but you've also got this upper engine, your trunk and your arm. And connecting that is the pelvis. And so there's a lot of energy that flows through that pelvis, and the musculature, the tendons, the ligaments around that pelvis have to facilitate that transfer of energy from the legs up through the torso, trunk, and arm. And so they basically found that energy through the kinetic chain flows from the drive leg to the pelvis during the stride phase, and from the pelvis to the stride leg and trunk during the arm cocking phase. And so there's a lot of work that is kind of key into understanding what's happening at really the center, or what we would call the root segment of the human body. There was another publication in 2014 by Roach and Lieberman that suggested something really similar, that basically if you're talking about energy flow, if you're talking about energy transferring from the lower half to the upper half, it has to go through the pelvis, and that pelvis is key. Pelvis is key for timing and to kind of transition from the timing of the hips to the timing of the shoulders to the timing of downward segments to ball release. And so we kind of focused in directly on the pelvis and hips for this study. I will kind of add a little caveat and a limitation is if you're familiar with kind of biomechanics labs, there's, especially on the research side, it's really awesome if you have a mound that has force plates in it. We recently got a mound that has force plates in it, and that's great. We can now capture pitchers in more of a natural environment. and get their ground reaction forces. This was done in a lab on flat ground throwing. And so they were able to basically alter their strides on flat ground, not on a typical mound. But a couple of things that stood out, as I said, we're just kind of digging into this, and I just kind of wanted to highlight a couple of things. Is there were some differences in those who were able to overstride and those times when they came in and they were pitching on the understride. One of the things that we noticed is there was greater energy absorption at the back hip in that overstride. And kind of like I was talking about, they're taking longer to get down the mound or for them stride out. They're basically creating more energy, but that energy has to get absorbed. It has to be maintained. And I imagine someone who has to balance on one leg without rocking and moving and tilting, you've got to have a strong back hip to kind of hold that energy in place. And then as you're striding out, you don't want to be wobbling and tilting. You want to have a strong base to transfer that. And during that stride phase, you're only on one leg. And so there's a lot of energy that's being absorbed in the back hip when you take a longer stride. We saw the opposite with the understride, that we saw greater energy generation. And so while the longer stride was more of a generation and then a maintaining or absorption of energy, that shorter stride was purely more of just a quick burst, more of a greater energy generation. And it wasn't really locked in on trying to absorb or maintain energy because they didn't have that very far to go. And then lastly, excuse me, lastly, what we also saw is that during arm acceleration, so basically from max external rotation or layback through ball release, when that arm is accelerating as fast as it can, during that phase, which occurs after stride foot contact, we saw that the lumbosacral joint, or basically what connects the hips and pelvis to the torso, that first joint past your hips and pelvis, we saw more energy being transferred through that joint in the overstride compared to the understride. So we can kind of talk about energy flow. We can kind of throw out some numbers if you need them, but what exactly does this mean? What can we take away from this, and how do we apply this? So I talked about, looking at athletes, looking at pitchers, that if we see them, if they're not striding out, especially on the MLB side, if they're way below 70%, or as some research suggests, below 80%, you want to try to make some changes to increase their stride length. But that is going to be on an individual basis. And what that means is, can that athlete handle the different strategies that you're going to try to put on them? So if you're going to have someone take a longer stride, can their lead leg block that? Can their lead leg have the strength to hold that and not sink into the greater load that you're asking it to hold? And same thing with the back leg and your lumbosacral joint and that energy transfer. If this is a person who's had a short stride for a certain period of time, is it a range of motion thing that they can't get into a longer stride? Is it a strength aspect that they can't get into a longer stride? And if you are going to make changes to them, are you planned and prepared to work with your PT and S&C staff to get them into, greater external rotation or greater strength gains, so that they can actually apply the change that you're trying to make to move efficiently? So basically, just in summary, pitchers looking to increase stride length may need to improve strength in the hip and through their core to maintain proper pitching mechanics and improve performance. And thank you very much. And that's our campus there at Point Loma, San Diego. Yeah, what's up? Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty good. Yeah, we don't have any data on that. I think it was mentioned earlier. I tend to think that internally in a lot of orgs, they've got some good resources to that, and definitely orgs are very secretive or keep tight with the things that they were doing. We come from, I think, a viewpoint of if we think that there's changes that are going to be made, what's the lowest hanging fruit? What's the easy change that we can make first? And we'd probably want to look at how you move and how fast you move, not only kind of in our lab throwing, but, in the gym, working with the strength coaches. And that's kind of like the best that we've seen is when we collaborate with teams or we go out and do consultations or demos for orgs, is being in a room with the pitching coach, making kind of suggestions and tips for changing players, while also looking at their past history, while also consulting with ATs, PTs, SNCs. So I don't really have an answer to that, but I think that's a really interesting, way to look at things. And it definitely needs to be considered.
That Road paper, where they looked at the understride, overstride, also showed that increasing stride length increased like the physiological response. So it was greater exertion when they were overstriding.
Yeah.
So I mean, the next logical step from that is that it increase their repeatability, which could in turn change their mechanics. So do you have any concerns about recommending it for stride length when it could increase the overall?
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up. Thanks for that, Mike. I didn't mention this, but they looked over, I think it was 80 pitches in the original study. And they looked at things like changes in heart rate. They looked at some enzymes in saliva. And like Mike was saying, they basically had enough evidence to suggest that overstriding increased fatigue. What was interesting in that is, like, I would say probably metabolically, they saw that increased fatigue. And what you would think is, okay, well, that means that, their velo would drop, but their velo didn't drop. It was pretty much kind of maintained compared to the understride. So to me, I think what my mind goes to is it's definitely something that would be concerning and something to think about. And I think especially now with changes in the pitch clock, that combination of, once again, if you're gonna make a suggestion to an athlete, I mean, it's got to be an individually based decision. And I think it's going to be a decision that's multiple people would agree on, not just in one individual making these suggestions. And taking into consideration some of the other things that are going on, like, is this going to be metabolically more demanding on this pitcher? Okay, if that is going to be metabolically more demanding, but we see beneficial performance, okay, are they fueling throughout the innings properly? How's their sleep? How's their hydration? And that might mean ramping them up slower, or that might mean limiting their pitch count, kind of something I would go to. Yes.
Sorry to say, but this long stride, is it taking place in the same amount of time? So it's physically faster, or is it actually a more easily volume?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for this, because it was a decrease of 25%, an increase of 25%, comparing that, the timing was a little different. I'll have to go back and see. I'm not familiar off the top of my head exactly what the timing is, but I'm leaning towards it did take longer to move for that increased stride.
When you're talking about improving performance, I'm assuming you're defining performance as velocity.
Yeah, for us right now, it's just velocity. Yeah.
So I assume maybe you have to get maybe anecdotally, are there changes in control, like if they're becoming more fatigued, maybe, or maybe long stride to come off down or something like that? Maybe they can throw faster, but they're less likely to throw it, right? So that's something that you'd be worried about, or have seen.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I would say we kind of look at it in a couple of ways. Is if I'm going to, let's say alter something like stride, which I think to me is probably something that's probably a little bit easier to alter, because, you could put a piece of tape down, you could put a stick down, you'd be like, hey, step over this, or like get to this point, right? Like you can kind of put some restraints in there to alter stride that would be a lot easier than maybe some arm path stuff, right? So kind of there's some low hanging fruit there where it's like, I think it'd be easier to work on this. When it comes to things like performance, it's interesting. I think, yeah, for this reference, I'm talking about performance. But as you were talking to me on performances, I'm also thinking about like the biomechanical performance, which is I want to look at, for me personally, an easy low hanging fruit is just like, how are they sequencing? How fast is their pelvis moving? how fast is their trunk moving, and then how's the timing of their pelvis, and then how's the timing of their trunk. And so for me, those were things where it's like, gosh, Kyle did and Alex did a great job kind of showing those changes is like, are we increasing velo, but we've now increased the load? Well, maybe that's not the direction we want to go. So I think like initially, like performance, just looking at velo is great, but you have to supplement that with things like, okay, how is their strategy or how's their compensation beyond? Because obviously, changing anything at the feet is going to have changes up the chain, and you have to be able to be aware of that, and you have to be able to measure that. So yeah, I think it was pretty simplistic for me to just call performance, velo, but you have to supplement that with, lots of other things to look at. So that was a great point to make. Yes.
Feel that there might be any applications for this in case of like injury, sort of like manipulating stride length to take strain off of their body, like pelvic injury or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things I was just thinking about a minor league pitcher that we saw earlier this week who was coming back from a Tommy John surgery. And, a lot of these programs, you don't start off throwing on a mound, you start off on flat ground, you go into some long toss and things like that. So I think there's definitely some things that could be done on the rehab side, especially coming back from, okay, let's get you on the mound and get you familiar with that and get you moving. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. Maybe you're not going your full stride, maybe you're shortening that, but kind of to the previous point, there's some other things that are said. If you're going to shorten their stride strategies, there's compensations that a pitcher is going to make. And we kind of show that doing that isn't really the compensations that we'd want to see for that pitcher, because it kind of tends to put added stress, especially at the elbow. Okay. This is a question. I'm not going to answer it. Maybe somebody else knows. It says, does the front or back leg get injured more? Anybody got any? I don't know. Sorry about that. And any one last question here? Yes.
Back to velocity. You've seen that pretty much you get the same velocity out of the hand, but if you're striding further, you're releasing in closer planes. So you would get a higher perceived velocity because the matter the effect of the pattern less time you have.
Yeah, we'll let the driveline guys look into that. That's good. But good point. Good point. Okay, thank you very much.